What if the flood story we know is only partially understood? Hidden in the ancient Hebrew wording of Genesis lies a detail that changes the entire interpretation of divine judgment. The text uses the term kol bazar, commonly translated as all flesh, but in its original context it specifically refers to living beings moving upon the land surface, not necessarily. In 5, everything beneath the waters, or beyond that domain. This distinction matters. It suggests the flood narrative may describe a judgment focused on the terrestrial world rather than an absolute eradication of all life in every, 5, possible realm. Genesis 6:17 declares that destruction will come upon all flesh. Yet the Hebrew structure consistently ties that phrase to land-dwelling life, emphasizing scope rather than universal annihilation. Seen this way, the story becomes less about total cosmic reset and more about a defined act of judgment within a specific boundary. If this hidden detail in Genesis is already changing the way you see the flood narrative, stay with this carefully. What comes next pushes this interpretation even further into territory most readers never notice in the text. Genesis 7 describes waters rising and covering the high mountains, while Genesis 8 depicts their gradual retreat, restoring the land. And the narrative follows a cycle of removal and renewal, but always through the lens of the Earth's surface as the primary stage of judgment. This raises a difficult question. Was the flood truly absolute in scope, or geographically and existentially limited in ways later interpretation expanded? The text itself does not fully resolve this tension. Instead, the 5, it leaves a structured but ambiguous framework, one that continues to generate debate about the true extent of the event described in Genesis. Ancient records begin to align around a single disturbing pattern, a highly advanced civilization that ends not in fire, but beneath the ocean. Plato describes Atlantis as a powerful and morally corrupted society, ultimately punished by divine forces. Yet the language he uses is strikingly specific. It does not describe total destruction by fire or force, but a sinking into the sea itself. That difference is critical. To be destroyed by water suggests erasure. To sink into water suggests relocation into another domain. Atlantis, in this sense, was not simply wiped out of existence. It was submerged, displaced into depths that remain outside normal human history. This raises a deeper possibility, that Atlantis may preserve the memory of a much older world. The 5-1 that predates recorded civilization and appears in fragmented form across ancient traditions. When compared with early biblical accounts of a corrupted pre-flood world, the similarities become harder to dismiss. Both traditions describe a civilization marked by moral collapse and eventual judgment. One survives as theological narrative, the other as philosophical myth. Yet both converge on the same outcome, the fall of an advanced society removed from divine order, followed by a cataclysm that reshapes the world. The question is no longer whether Atlantis is real in a literal historical sense, but whether it functions as a cultural echo of a deeper shared memory, a memory preserved differently across civilizations, but pointing toward a common ancient catastrophe. If that is the case, then the boundary between myth and history becomes unstable. Atlantis is no longer an isolated Greek story. It becomes a fragment of a wider, older narrative preserved in human memory. A 5 hinting at a world that existed before the world we know today. Before dismissing this as mythology, 5 notice how consistently this pattern appears across unrelated ancient civilizations. What follows connects Atlantis to something far more persistent across history. What emerges after the collapse of Atlantis is far more unsettling than its destruction itself. Across later traditions, attention shifts not to what was lost, but to what appears afterward, something rising from the sea, not vanishing into it. On the coastal regions of the Mediterranean, long after the Great Flood narratives, ancient records describe a deity associated directly with the ocean depths. This figure, known as Dion, was not remembered as a distant celestial god, but as something intimately tied to the sea itself. The Philistines revered him with intense devotion. In 5, a worship that persisted even in the face of conquest and cultural upheaval. This presence appears not only in myth but is also reflected in biblical accounts. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 5, the Ark of the Covenant is brought to Ashdod, where it is placed within the temple dedicated to Dion. Ashdod itself is described as a major Philistine city along the coast of Canaan. A 5-5, a region repeatedly associated in ancient accounts with extraordinary beings and legendary figures. What makes this account so striking is the way Dion is portrayed. He is described as a hybrid form, part human, part fish. A figure with a human upper body and a fish-like lower form, existing between land and sea, as if belonging fully to neither world. This image places him in a category that blurs the boundary between mythology and memory, between symbolic representation and preserved tradition. The biblical narrative intensifies this symbolic confrontation. The Ark of the Covenant, representing the authority of the God of Israel, stands in opposition to the image of Dion in his own temple. The setting is no longer just geographical, it becomes theological. A clash between two distinct orders of existence, one rooted in the land, the other rising from the sea. From this point onward, the question only deepens instead of resolving. Dion is not presented as a marginal figure of myth, but as a central object of worship in a coastal civilization, embed within the same world where giants and ancient lineages are repeatedly referenced. What becomes more disturbing is that Dion is not an isolated figure within ancient memory. Instead, similar descriptions appear across completely separate civilizations, as if the same image has been preserved in different languages and traditions. In ancient Mesopotamian records, there is a figure known as Oannes, described in early Sumerian and Babylonian accounts with unusual consistency. This being is depicted as half human and half fish, emerging from the sea during the day to interact directly with early human societies. According to these traditions, Oannes did not merely appear as a symbol, but as a teacher-like presence. He is said to have brought foundational knowledge to humanity, agriculture, writing systems, architecture, B5 and legal structures, before returning each night to the ocean depths. This cycle of emergence and return reinforces the image of a being belonging primarily to the sea, yet temporarily engaging with the land. When placed alongside figures such as Dagon in Canaan and related marine deities referenced in other ancient traditions, a striking pattern emerges. Even Plato's account of Atlantis, though written in a different cultural and philosophical context. 5 introduces the idea of advanced beings linked to a lost maritime civilization associated with divine origin stories. Across these narratives, separated by geography and time, the same structural motif appears repeatedly. Entities associated with water, emerging from the sea, and 5 bringing knowledge, and then withdrawing back into the depths. The persistence of this archetype across unrelated cultures raises a deeper question about its origin. It is no longer a matter of isolated mythological invention, but of a recurring template embedded in ancient human memory. Whether interpreted as symbolic storytelling or as fragmented recollection of a shared past, the consistency of this marine teacher figure suggests a deeper continuity beneath the surface of mythology itself. To understand why figures like Dagon appear specifically within regions associated with giants, the narrative must return to the Book of Enoch. where a far older and more radical account is presented. In this tradition, the Watchers are described not as minor spiritual beings, NT5, but as high-ranking celestial entities assigned with defined roles within the cosmic order. Yet the text records a decisive rupture, a voluntary descent in human realm, a calculated crossing of boundaries that altered the structure of the world itself. According to the Book of Enoch, 200 Watchers descended upon Mount Hermon and bound themselves in a collective pact. This agreement is described as a deliberate rebellion, involving the exchange of forbidden knowledge with humanity, knowledge related to celestial secrets, advanced skills, and powers that were not meant to be shared. From this union between Watchers and human beings emerged the Nephilim, depicted as hybrid offspring of immense size and influence. Their presence is portrayed as a corruption of natural order, spreading across the earth and reshaping early human civilization. What follows in the tradition is not only biological distortion, but the rise of a pre-flood world that develops at an accelerated and unstable pace. Civilizations described in these accounts are capable of achievements that later generations struggle to explain without invoking lost knowledge or advanced capability. This antediluvian era is remembered in fragmented traditions as a time of expansion beyond normal human limits. N5 followed inevitably by collapse. The narrative sets the stage for a world where boundaries between divine, human, and unnatural forms are no longer clearly defined, leading directly into the conditions associated with the coming judgment described in later texts. The ancient world preserves a consistent memory of a lost golden age that existed before the Great Flood, a time when the boundary between the divine, A5 and human realms was not yet sealed. Across civilizations, this era is remembered as a period of extraordinary contact between heaven and earth, when knowledge flowed freely and civilizations reached heights later generations would struggle to explain. But every tradition ends this age in rupture. The Sumerian flood narrative, the Babylonian account of Utnapishtim, and the Hindu story of Manu all describe the same turning point, a world consumed by overwhelming waters. E5 followed by a radical reset of human history. Within the Book of Enoch, the consequences of this collapse are even more severe. It describes the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers and human beings, as being destroyed during the cataclysmic judgment that swept across the earth. Yet their fate does not end with physical destruction. Their spirits are described as becoming restless and unclean entities, moving through the world in search of new forms to inhabit. However, a deeper question emerges that the text itself leaves unresolved. What about those Nephilim or Watcher lineages that had already begun adapting before the flood? If corruption and transformation had been unfolding for centuries, then certain strains of these beings may have developed characteristics suited for survival beyond land, possibly even within aquatic environments. This creates a critical tension within the narrative. The flood is portrayed as a comprehensive cleansing of the earth, yet the ocean depths remain outside its direct scope of description. If any form of adapted existence persisted there, 5, it would exist beyond the visible framework of judgment. When the waters eventually recede, the biblical record presents a striking development. The world is repopulated, yet traces of giants reappear with unexpected immediacy. Genesis 10 and Numbers 13 reference groups such as the Anakites, the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzumim in the land of Canaan, suggesting that the phenomenon believed to have been erased has, in some form, returned. The question becomes direct. If the flood removed all corrupted flesh from the earth, why do giants reappear so quickly in later accounts? One explanation claims corruption survived through human genealogy preserved on the ark, especially through the line of Ham. But another theory follows geography and pattern rather than lineage alone. After the flood, giants consistently appear in coastal zones, ports, 5 shore cities, and maritime regions. This is not random. It is concentrated around the sea. The Philistines are central to this pattern. B5, known as a seafaring people, they are linked to some of the most famous giant figures in the Bible. Goliath, described in Hebrew tradition as exceptionally tall, is identified as a Philistine warrior. His relatives are also described as giants. 5 all based along the Mediterranean coast where Dagon was worshipped. This repetition suggests more than isolated genetics. It points to a recurring emergence tied to coastal environments. Instead of returning from within human bloodlines alone, the giant presence seems repeatedly associated with the boundary between land and sea, hinting at an origin linked to the oceanic world rather than purely terrestrial survival. The mystery of coastal giants is only one layer of a much broader pattern that appears across ancient civilizations. Another, even more persistent motif is the recurring image of hybrid female beings tied to the sea. Modern language calls them mermaids, but ancient descriptions are far more severe and far less symbolic. In several early traditions, these beings are not portrayed as mythical entertainers, but as entities with specific physical traits and unsettling origins. Within certain apocryphal Hebrew traditions, there are references to women transformed into water-dwelling forms. Some accounts describe voluntary association with the Watchers, while others suggest abduction. In both cases, the transformation is not merely physical but fundamental, altering identity, nature, and destiny. This raises a critical question. Was this transformation punishment or adaptation? If such beings existed before the flood, their altered nature may have allowed survival in a way ordinary human flesh could not. Across the ancient world, the same figure appears again and again under different names. In Mesopotamian and African traditions, there is Mami Wata, a water-linked female spirit. In Greek sources, there are the Nereids, Oceanids, and siren-like beings associated with the sea. Medieval Europe preserves similar images in legends like Melusine, often depicted with aquatic or serpentine features. These descriptions emerge independently across regions that had no verified contact with each other. Yet the core structure remains strikingly consistent. A female entity connected to deep water, existing between human and non-human form. Even in later cultural symbolism, echoes of this figure persist into modern imagery, reinforcing its long-term presence in collective memory. Taken together, these repeated patterns suggest something deeper than coincidence or cultural borrowing. They point toward a shared ancient memory of a hybrid sea-linked archetype that persists across time, geography, and belief systems. The question returns with greater force. If the flood removed all corrupted flesh from the earth, why do giants reappear so quickly in the biblical record? One explanation is the ark transmission theory. It suggests corruption survived through human lineage preserved on Noah's Ark, especially within his family line. In this view, the flood was judgment, not a full genetic reset. The repeated structure across global flood myths, a chosen man, a vessel, and destruction by water, respects the idea of a shared ancient memory rather than isolated stories. Across these traditions, something else repeatedly appears: survival through water. Babylonian accounts even describe sea beings assisting the survivor, hinting at ancient links between humans and aquatic entities. This pattern later appears in coastal religions, sea gods, and civilizations that claimed divine origins from rivers and oceans. The second theory, more extreme, is the marine survival hypothesis. It proposes that certain altered Nephilim may have survived in deep ocean environments. as human societies rebuilt along coastlines, and 5. Contact with these beings could explain the sudden reappearance of giants in maritime regions. This aligns with biblical references, placing such figures among seafaring peoples like the Philistines and figures such as Dagon. The third theory comes from the Book of Enoch. It describes the Nephilim after the flood as disembodied spirits, continuing to influence the physical world indirectly. In this view, corruption is not only genetic but also spiritual, the 5 shaping human generations from unseen forces. Together, these theories overlap rather than exclude each other, forming a complex attempt to explain the persistent return of giants in post-flood history. Atlantis introduces a 4th lens that reshapes how post-flood history is interpreted. If it represents the central Nephilim civilization, then its destruction was not separate from the flood, but part of the same act of judgment. In this view, the same force that brought rain upon the earth also submerged the great island of the giants into the ocean depths. Atlantis was not simply erased, it was driven downward into a realm outside the reach of terrestrial judgment. With no safe land remaining, survival meant retreating into the only domain untouched by the surface catastrophe, the sea itself. Over time, as collective memory of the flood faded, new groups began to appear along major coastlines. These populations are reflected in ancient Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, described in the 2nd millennium BC as organized maritime forces, are 5 of unknown origin, arriving suddenly from the ocean with unfamiliar capabilities and influence. Their emergence across the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean zones suggests a coordinated maritime presence rather than isolated migrations. They are remembered not just as invaders, but as carriers of knowledge and power tied to the sea. At this point, Atlantis, the flood, and 5 and the Sea Peoples converge into a single interpretive framework, one in which the ocean is no longer a boundary, but the hidden stage where an ancient lineage survives and later re-enters human history. Among the Sea Peoples recorded in ancient Egyptian accounts, the Philistines stand out most clearly, linked in later traditions to Dagon and the memory of giants along the Mediterranean coast. Yet they were not alone. Fragments of similar beliefs appear across multiple coastal civilizations, all preserving echoes of something far older. Over time, many of these societies vanished, were absorbed, or erased, leaving only scattered traces of what they once remembered. But the deeper implication is not simple historical disappearance. It is continuity through conflict. The destruction of coastal cities in Hebrew tradition is not described as ordinary warfare. It aligns with a far older narrative thread, one that begins with the descent of the Watchers in ancient accounts like those preserved in the Book of Enoch. In this framework, the struggles in Canaan, including the campaigns attributed to Joshua, and 5 are not isolated events but later chapters of an unfinished confrontation stretching back before the flood itself. Each fallen city becomes more than a conquest. It becomes a rupture in a much larger network, one that once carried memory, knowledge, and identity tied to an ancient maritime lineage. Yet this network never fully disappears. Despite conquest, fire, and time, elements of it persist in symbols, rituals, place names, and even in religious imagery that later traditions attempt to reject. Even within the biblical text itself, references to Dagon, to giants, A5, and to the sea as an unconquered domain create an unintended record of what it seeks to distance itself from. This produces a paradox at the core of interpretation. The same sources that condemn this lineage also preserve its outline, and the consistency of these references across biblical, apocryphal, archaeological, A5 and mythological records suggests a pattern too structured to dismiss as coincidence. 5. One of the most striking moments in this tradition occurs in Ashdod. Day 5, where the Ark of the Covenant is placed inside the temple of Dagon after being captured. The act itself is not merely symbolic. It represents a confrontation between two opposing frameworks of power. According to the Book of Samuel, the statue of Dagon falls before the ark, and on the following day is found broken, its head and hands severed at the threshold. This is presented as a decisive theological reversal, yet the worship of Dagon does not end there. The Philistines continue to venerate him for generations, suggesting resilience rather than disappearance. A tradition tied to the sea proves difficult to erase, even under repeated conflict. This raises a larger question. Was the flood ever meant to erase everything, or only a specific domain? Genesis states that divine judgment was complete, yet later narratives show recurring patterns of survival, reappearance, and coastal concentration. This leads to a division between two spheres, the land subjected to judgment, and the sea left largely undefined within the same framework. In later apocalyptic texts, this boundary becomes even more charged. The Book of Revelation, chapter 13, describes a beast rising from the sea. I am 5 combining features of multiple predators and receiving authority over the earth. The symbolism echoes earlier marine-linked figures. 5 reinforcing the idea of a returning force emerging from the depths. Across this entire arc from Genesis to Revelation, a dual structure emerges, a terrestrial order shaped from dust, and a marine order associated with older, more ambiguous origins. Humanity exists between them, on the unstable boundary where both influences intersect. This tension is not presented as resolved. Instead, it intensifies into a broader reflection. If elements of the ancient maritime lineage survived, they would not remain isolated. Over time, they would merge, diffuse, and integrate along coastal civilizations. 5 leaving behind traces rather than direct continuity. The giants of Canaan, in this reading, are not anomalies. They are visible remnants of something deeper and more persistent. At this point, the question is no longer about isolated myths or symbols. It becomes about continuity. What survives when civilizations fall? And why the same patterns keep returning across time? The answer leads to a conclusion most historical interpretations avoid entirely. Nothing in this narrative fully disappears. It transforms, disperses, and reappears under new forms, until the line between myth, memory, and history becomes impossible to clearly separate.